fan and admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think that I'm carrying on much of the work that he started over 100 years ago, and do what thou wilt.
I do. 1, 2, 3, 4.
Rotten as I am in 1,000 ways, I have been chosen by the gods to bring to earth the basic word in which mankind will work for the next 2,000 years or so. I assure you, the world is ready for this move.
He died in 1947, at the age of 72. His body was cremated, and his ashes were scattered and lost. But the spirit of Aleister Crowley was set to rise again.
Johnn Lennon acknowledged him as a personal hero by putting him on the front cover of the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper album. Drugs guru Timmy Leary went tripping in Crowley's footsteps.
It's a great trip.
I mean, can't think of any other occultist who's been more influential on rock musicians than Aleister Crowley. Anyone close?
For the counterculture of the 60s, Crowley's work seemed to embody the desire for free expression and for a break with the past. Crowley seemed to have a special appeal for musicians who saw themselves as the social rebels of rock. He was included amongst the celebrities on the cover of the Beatles' hugely successful Sgt. Pepper album.
20 years ago today, Sgt. Pepper taught the band to play.
Aleister Crowley declared the death of Christianity. He was to be the new Messiah that would replace the pallid dead Christ.
I believe he was the real thing. He had given himself under demonic control. He was evil.
Very clever. A genius, for God's sake. A raving genius, you know. In a world of little tiny people, this crowd is saying, my God, why are you so unhappy? You want to make love? Well, make love, for Christ's sake. You want to take drugs? You want to expand your consciousness? Please do it.
Direct, the most natural way to find God is through mind-expanding drugs.
He's a seeker and a prophet, a villain and a pariah. Timmy Leary, the high priest of LSD. Leary's influence helped shape the music, fashion, and politics of a new generation, becoming the unabashed leader of the psychedelic movement.
Poisonous, evil man, Dr. Timothy Leary.
And Nixon called him the most dangerous man in the world.
Let the kids get high. Why don't we all turn on together?
The Catholic Church could be reborn all over again if they just discovered the new sacrament. It's not the little wafer, it's the psychedelic trap.
This is a gesture of love. I'm open to you.
Psychedelics are chemicals that are structurally similar to neurotransmitters already used by our brains. When we ingest them, they bind to receptors and alter cognition and perception in ways we're still trying to understand.
We know nothing about psychedelics.
Very little is known about psychedelic substances.
These drugs do open up another level of consciousness.
When many people think of psychedelics, they think about people challenging societal norms and recreational thrill seekers. But that only attends to a particularly narrow slice of human history and culture. Fossil records, cave drawings, and archaeological digs have all provided evidence that humans have been using psychedelic compounds for thousands of years. And by used, I don't just mean in the stereotypical trip out sense.
Well, magic Technically, it's always existed, but it's existed in other forms, shamanism. Not necessarily Native American shamanism, but maybe even earlier forms of shamanism.
This is a critical issue with regards to the shamanic transformation, is that people go through these terrible, terrible experiences, often drug-induced, by the way, with regards to the shaman. They usually use psychedelic chemicals of one form or another, often mushrooms, but they've come up with some very strange concoctions like ayahuasca down in the Amazon. And ayahuasca is an amazing substance. It's made out of the bark of one thing and another plant whose name I don't remember, that hardly even grow in the same place and that have to be cooked together in a special way.
Scientists know very little about how ayahuasca works, since its illegal status in many countries makes it difficult to study. We do know that its key ingredient is dimethyltryptamine, or DMT, which is a hallucinogen thought to occur naturally in the human brain in small amounts. DMT can create psychoactive effects by acting on certain receptors in the brain. But normally, DMT is broken down rapidly by enzymes in the brain. However, ayahuasca is actually a brew made from two plants. One contains DMT, and the second contains a chemical inhibitor that blocks our body's ability to break down DMT, allowing the effects to last for hours.
And no one has any idea how the damn Amazonians figured that out. It looks impossible. And if you ask them, they say, well, the plants told us how to do it, which, Western people don't find very helpful, but the shamans are perfectly happy with that description. And ayahuasca takes them apart, and it does that in part because it affects the serotonergic system very, very powerfully, like all psychedelics do. All the real psychedelics have basically the same structure. Give people psilocybin, this active chemical in magic mushrooms, same structure basically as LSD and mescaline, and they have a mystical experience, which is very common among people who take these sorts of chemicals. Then their personality transforms permanently.
But I really was frightened of that kind of stuff, because it's what you're taught when you're young, hey, there's watch out for them devil drugs. So when acid came round, we'd heard that you're never the same. It alters your life and you never think the same again. And I think John was rather excited by that prospect. I was rather frightened by that prospect. I thought, just what I need. To have some funny little thing where I can never get back home again. Oh, geez, may not be the greatest move.
Well, I had a dentist anyway. One night, John and his wife Cynthia and Patty and myself were having dinner at this guy's house.
A dentist in London laid it on George, me and our wives without telling us at a dinner party at his house. He was a friend of George's and our dentist at the time. And he just put it in our coffee or something. Finally we got in the lift and we all thought there was a fire in the lift. It was just a little red light and we were all screaming like that. We thought when we went to the club, we thought it was on fire. Hysterical. And we all arrived on the floor, because this was a discotheque that was up a building, We get, and the lift stops and the door opens and we're all going, ah!
It felt like the elevator was on fire and that we were going into hell or something.
You'd have to understand what acid does to the mind in order to understand how a person can get confused behind drugs.
But it was powerful enough to keep you in a fog for all those years, even after you stopped using it.
I used to think that you came down off an acid trip after 12 hours. That's not true. Okay, when you take acid, your mind expands beyond these moral characteristics and your concepts of right and wrong. So you step out beyond those bounds, and when you step out beyond those bounds, the imagination begins to take over. And the imagination can be a very deceitful thing. When you take acid, you go out beyond that, you think you're coming back to where you started from. Originally, you don't. And every time you drop acid, you get a little bit further away from reality. And I took so much acid that I just was what I would term spaced. And it took me many years to what I term now re-enter. And that was just through not having any acid and having to deal with reality every day.
Atkins became one of Charlie's girls, as they were called, one of the first. More would join her, and in time, all of them would develop a fanatical loyalty to Charles Manson, nurtured by his persuasiveness and hyped by the unrelenting use of drugs.
Dr. Robin Carhart Harris, one of the first British researchers in over 40 years to investigate the effects of psychedelics on the human mind. He and his colleagues have found that psychedelics don't increase brain activity, as previously thought. Instead, they decrease activity in certain areas. And the greater the decrease, the greater the reported feelings of what is called ego dissolution, or ego death. Your ego is your self-identity. It's the part that separates you from everything else. The part that creates narratives about the outside world and your story in it. When the ego dissolves, your sensations and feelings don't cease, like when you're unconscious. Instead, your attachment to your identity does. And all that's left is naked perception. Ego dissolution is a concept that I find difficult to wrap my head around. But people who take psychedelics say that it can be an extremely frightening experience, but also a profoundly transformative one.
Everything falls apart. All learned structures, all thought patterns, all beliefs, opinions, emotional convictions, positive or negative, they all fall apart.
Network. It's called a default mode network that seems to relate to our sense of self or ego. We've seen in other studies that during a psychedelic experience, that network is dramatically compromised. It shows a kind of disintegration, and actually that process relates quite strongly to people's ego dissolution.
Crowley had hoped to get his disciples into influential positions in America to influence the masses. One such disciple was former Harvard professor turned drug guru Timothy Leary. Timothy Leary, the defunct Harvard professor, led the drug revolution in the 1960s as he handed out mescaline and LSD like it was candy to the youth. This in turn opened up the hippie youth of the West to the pagan demonic gods of the East, who were also promoted by Aleister Crowley.
In 1971, Timothy Leary had an epiphany during a tarot reading that utilized a set of cards designed by Crowley. His revelation? That he was Crowley reborn and was to complete the work Crowley began, preparing humanity for cosmic consciousness. Leary acknowledged this powerful connection with the great beast in a letter to Wilson, observing that the coincidences, synchronicities between my life and his are embarrassing. From this connection flowed frequent references to Crowley, his philosophy, and their common destinies in Leary's writings and speech.
Crowley predicted that America would pick up, quote, a few axioms on which a working majority can agree, a few dogmas which it could rally. Do what thou wilt, of course, became do your own thing, and if it feels good, do it in the 1960s. Timothy Leary came up with a few of his own.
Turn on, tune in, and drop out. We're turned on, and we're tuned in, and we're very dropped out. Turn on, tune in, and drop out.
Drop out of high school, drop out of college, drop out of graduate school.
We tell young people today, drop out of school, because schools, education today, is the worst narcotic drug of all. Don't politic, don't vote. These are old men's games, impotent and senile old men that want to put you onto their old chess games of war and power. Drop out. Tune in with natural things. Take off your shoes. Get back in tune with God's harmony. Surround yourself with beauty and sacred objects. You can't get caught in the conforming, rote lockstep, which we call American society.
Manson appeared with cuts on his forehead in the sign of a cross.
It appears that he has a scab in the form of an X on his forehead in blood. It apparently was done with a razor blade. Manson has taken the position that that is a symbolic gesture indicating that he has X'd himself out of society at large.
Charles Manson, 36, chose a house at random, tied up the family at gunpoint, then ordered his followers to go inside and commit ritual slaughter.
LSD was the drug of choice for Manson and his so-called family. Acid had gone somewhat mainstream at that point, a symbol of the peace, free love, and expansion of the mind that had come to define much of the 60s. But in the Manson case, LSD took a menacing turn. It was associated with ghastly violence, madness, the wilting of flower power.
It's Patricia Krenwinkel who said, I took so much LSD, I was LSD. And it altered their consciousness.
So after 300 LSD trips in 2 years, when Manson sent Susan Atkins and others of his family to kill, they did it. Later, looking, sounding, and acting crazy, Susan Atkins spilled it all and tell a grand jury what happened. With terrible detail, she would describe how she murdered movie actress Sharon Tate and her yet unborn baby, and then participated in the murder of 4 others on that hot summer's night at the actress's Hollywood home.
Tate was married to director Roman Polanski and was 8.5 months pregnant. All of the mutilated bodies were found the next morning by a housekeeper. They were scattered around the estate.
I feel good feeling towards everything. I feel no bad. I know no bad. I'm not against you, huh? Are you bitter? Bitter? No.
Satan had effectively slipped in his destructive teachings to undermine traditional moral values through the cloak of a supposed anti-materialistic peace movement. Crowley taught that his satanic doctrine should be cloaked under the lie of love, and he believed the youth would fall for it. If Timothy Leary was Crowley's drug guru of the 1960s, Leary dubbed Johnn Lennon and the Beatles as the 4 evangelists. The Beatles wrote the song Come Together as a campaign song for Leary's hopeful presidential bid that, thank God, never got off the ground.
I've been an admirer of Aleister Crowley. I think that I'm carrying on much of the work that he started over 100 years ago, and I think the 60s themselves. You know, Crowley said he was in favor of finding your own self and do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law under love. It was a very powerful statement. I'm sorry he isn't around now to appreciate the glories that he started.
The book of the law states, do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law. In other words, people have the right to determine exactly how to live their lives, regardless of moral and religious boundaries.
The phrase, do what thou wilt, was taken from the Book of the Law, Crowley's most renowned work, and one whose composition is worth understanding in the context of our study.
We're at the Great Pyramid now. This is where Crowley and his wife came on their honeymoon. And one night they decided to spend a night inside the King's chamber. This is just for Crowley really to show off and show what a great magician he is to his wife. They must have done this on their own, him and Rose. Must have been quite an eerie thing to do. This is it. This is the King's chamber.
I wanted my wife to see what a great magician I was. We went accordingly after dinner with candles. I had with me a small notebook in which was written the preliminary invocation of the Goetia.
The Goetia is a grimoire. It's probably the closest thing to a black magic book. It's the lesser key of Solomon. It's got nothing to do with invoking angels. It's got nothing to do with anything particularly spiritual. It's purely to raise demons and nothing else. This must have been one hell of a honeymoon.
Back in Cairo, they were continuing their orgy of hedonistic excess when the black magic ritual in the Great Pyramid had an unexpected result that was to be the turning point in Crowley's life.
Rose got into a strange state of mind. I had never seen anything like it before. She kept on repeating, dreamily, yet intensely, "They are waiting for you. They are waiting for you."
When Crowley asked Rose who was waiting, she kept repeating that it was Horus, an Egyptian god. Crowley was puzzled and irritated by his wife's bizarre behavior. She knew nothing of magic and even less of Egyptology. Surely she, of all people, was not receiving a message from the gods. Crowley decided to take Rose down to the Egyptian Museum to test what she was saying. Rose had never visited the museum before. To Crowley's amazement, she rushed through rooms full of ancient artifacts until suddenly she stopped dead. There, There he is. It was an image of the same God she claimed to have seen in her vision. Crowley was stunned. What could this mean? Rose told him that they had to go back to the hotel room and wait to find out.
There seems to be that instance back in the museum in Cairo when he went to look at this exhibit, which was Exhibit 666. And after that, getting in touch with somebody that said they were the god Horus. I think at that point, something happened within his life. He opened himself up to a power that never ever left him, which he developed. And I believe he was the real thing. I believe that people that came into contact with him came into contact with that which was supernaturally evil. He had given himself under that demonic control, and that demonic control could now affect him and could work through him.
At midday on the 4th of April, 1904, in a hotel room in Cairo, what he had been waiting for all his life was about to happen. Crowley heard an unearthly voice from over his left shoulder. For 1 hour, at precisely the same time over the next 3 days, Crowley said that the voice dictated to him the book of the law, the work that would become the Bible of his new religion.
The book of the law, it just really is ripping up everything. It's ripping up the Bible, it's ripping up the Quran, you know, it's ripping up all the holy books and saying, we're starting fresh now. This is the word of the new eon. We're going to peck out the eyes of Christ on the cross. It's very, very blasphemous. It's all about liberation. It's all about having no restrictions at all. You follow your path, you follow your goal in life, and you do that above all else.
The crux of Crowley's demonic creed was just that each individual has no higher authority than their own will, that we are free to live life as we please. And this was the lie that the serpent hissed in the garden.
The great beast died in 1947, and for a decade it seemed all his ideas had died with him. But then his do-what-thou-wilt philosophy found a new home with a generation that was experimenting with free love, drugs, and alternative beliefs. Crowley had pushed the same boundaries 40 years earlier. He was now a 60s icon.
Do what thou wilt often resonates in the words of the popular mantra, do your own thing.
And the thing is, whatever is good for you is the best for you, you know. It's a simple thing, but people don't understand that.
Doing your own thing means doing your own thing, not doing exactly what everybody else is doing, but doing what suits you.
Total freedom for everybody is our goal, you know. That way, you know, it'll be a utopia.
People are frightened of freedom. They think freedom, oh, there'll be excesses. Of course there would be excess to an extent, and then it would settle down. The way the porno films don't pull so many people in now. So what? It'll level out. And all forms of freedom will be the same as that. If people are allowed to be completely free, it will level out, and people would be less inhibited and not be frightened of each other and wouldn't have to take drugs to prevent being hurt by each other.
Today, Crowley's followers believe that he was a true prophet because he foresaw a society that has now embraced ideas of sexual and spiritual freedom. Others are not so sure.
I think today modern occultism sees a very watered-down version of Crowley. They gloss over some of the atrocious things that he did, and they just want to see him as a benign humanist, somebody who said, let's be free, let's go with the flow. And it is to deny an awful lot of evilness that happened in his practices. We should be open and honest about Aleister Crowley.
You can't kill love. You can't kill the soul. And the love and the soul is in the penitentiaries, and it's in the jails, and those brothers and sisters are coming out soon. And they're going to judge you as you have judged them. You know what? The system has just judged itself. It's just judged itself. It's all a matter of time now. We know where we're going.
Where?
To the desert.